So, throughout history, development in the monetary system and society have mostly gone hand in hand. And this interplay has been like one side of the story pulling up the other side, leading to dramatic leaps in economic activity over time. And on one side, while we have key innovations in money payments that have really led to a lot of latent types of demand coming out from users, we have also seen the needs of the society, the needs and demands of the society with respect to everything monetary or money related change and adapt. So these are some of the things that have actually led to, if you see in the last 10 years, just charting out the growth of what finance and technology have done, it's grown by leaps and bounds. So this is exactly what we will try exploring in this episode of the FinTech Chroniclers LinkedIn audio room. And as we look into some of the reports, one of the things that I found very interesting was that most of them kind of projected the fintech market capitalization anywhere between 600 billion to 990 billion by 2029 in just 5 years. And depending on whom you ask, a lot of them would probably put the market cap somewhere between 220 billion to a 380 billion as of today. So the way that I thought I would go about doing it is there were five broad reports that I had gone through before this entire episode. So I will be kind of summarizing all five of them and bringing out the top highlights. Three of them are international fintech reports and fintech state of fintech report, etc., etc. Whereas two of them are exclusively India focused. So I do want to spend a little more time over there, especially given one of them was literally titled FinTech Report 2024 India Rising. So it's going to be a very interesting sort of a talk that we're going to have today. But yes, before we jump into these reports, hello and welcome back to everyone who's tuning in live today. And for all of you who are watching, going to be watching the replay as well. If you are new here, a quick intro. I am Kamalika and I also go by the pseudonym of the FinTech Chronicler. And apart from my weekly newsletters, I've started doing these LinkedIn audio rooms once a week as well, so that all of us can collectively geek out about the latest fintech news. So, at any time that you have any questions or even a differing point of view, do feel free to raise your hand and come up on stage and let's discuss and add to each other's understanding of fintech because I think that's the best way that one can learn about the industry. Okay, so let's get started. Now, I am going to say I am a little biased towards the people who will be watching the replay because I am going to also project some of these reports onto my screen over here as well, as and when I keep talking about it. So, the first report that I did want to talk about was titled FinTech Industry Trends 2024, the year of the connected customer, and this was by a company called as Intellias, and they had some very interesting takes on the current state of fintech as it is. So just to summarize it, 2 in 3 financial transactions globally are now made online. They also believe that 40% of existing banking roles will be disrupted by machine learning. The total investment in fintech for the year is already at a 50 billion. There are about 500 new fintechs created every year. 20 billion smart things, or the enablement of AI into different devices has become the next norm for customers nowadays. 30% of existing banking roles are going to be disrupted either by machine learning or by very advanced tech patterns that are taking over some of these roles. So that's if you are a banker listening in, then you may want to start upskilling with respect to these AI roles as well. And while we've achieved all of this, I think there's still, this report also highlights the fact that there is a huge potential for people to grow because there are still 2 billion unbanked people, and mobile apps, most of them are digitally connected. So mobile apps could be one great medium to addressing their financial needs as well. And finally, they talk a little bit about blockchain because about $5.6 billion was raised by a lot of these blockchain companies since 27 through what is known as an initial coin offering, which is very similar to our entire IPO listing. Only thing, you start investing in the concept of the entire blockchain network. You don't really have proof that these things are going to scale and work out. So the fact that 5.6 billion from 2017 have already been raised through these mediums, that's a huge number over there for people to just invest in a proof of concept. There's no product, there is no customers also, and yet people are investing into all of this. So that was, I think, one of the very interesting points that this report kind of brought up over there. Now, some of the other things that this report did mention, which I thought were pretty interesting, was that while the demand and competition for various fintech features is pretty high, what is now happening is that a lot of banks are moving out of their lethargic, tech aversion and adopting a lot of these new technologies. We've seen this play out very well. So previously, if you see, most banks, not just in India but even abroad, would view these technological improvements or new technology as a cost center. But banks like JP Morgan, Bank of America, which recently, by the way, had spectacular quarterly earnings reported in, and I will be kind of summarizing it over the week as well, because those quarterly reports were loaded. They've started seeing technology as an enabler for reaching out to consumers where they didn't have a presence. So that's definitely, the competition in fintech is definitely getting more fierce. Another thing that this report kind of highlighted was that the driving force behind fintech adoption, now I know a lot of people assume that that would be Gen Z's, but actually they found that millennials are the ones who are driving a lot of these high end sort of fintech companies over there, especially to do activities like tracking or building their wealth, tracking their expenses, and to make sure that they are on the right path financially. And lastly, they also mentioned about open banking, and this is something that's very close to my heart, because I did work on the entire account aggregator stack in India, which is India's solution to open banking. And we've seen that adoption take up in the last year. I mean, just to quote a brief stat over here, I think right now, if I do go into the entire AA ecosystem dashboard that's out there, there are close to about 75 million new accounts that are linked onto the account aggregator stack, of which 33 million just came up since the start of the year. That's how exponentially, even in India, we've been adopting open banking and open finances, and the entire concept of embedding financial services into everything that we do on a day on day basis. That's also been increasing. So, that's a very interesting highlight from this report that I found, and I could relate a lot to it simply because of the entire aspects of open finance that they spoke about. Okay, I will take a quick pause here because I know not a lot of people are acquainted with open finance. So I'll probably spend a minute or two explaining what open finance is. And the thesis of open finance is actually pretty interesting, because, well, as consumers of financial products, we typically, while we generate a lot of data points for our banks or our asset management houses, or even the depository where our dematerialized stocks are residing, we generate a lot of data for all of them. However, if you wanted to port all of these information into one single place and access it in a very easy to consume format, till 2021, which is when account aggregators in India came into force. I mean, they were conceptualized a lot earlier, but they started operating in 2021. Till then, it was a big challenge for us to kind of go about and get all of these information. And the usability of these information was again another problem. Like, just for instance, if I had to port my bank statement from SBI, and I also wanted my bank statement from HDFC in order for a lender to underwrite my transactions that are happening, both the formats of both these bank statements, they're, at the end of the day, they're storing the same information, right? But the formats of both of these were completely different, that reconciling and massaging it into a proper consumable format was a big challenge over there. So open banking kind of tries to make all of that, open finance tries to make all of that a lot easier. The way that they're doing it, and in India especially, if you see, we've implemented the concept of account aggregators. So everything is consent driven. The minute you share your consent to an account aggregator to pull, whatever kind of data that you want from your financial institution in a very secured fashion, and it's all end to end encrypted, by the way. So the account aggregators also cannot see your data or use that data for any purpose. And you can securely get authentic data in real time at your if you're using an account aggregator application into your app, or you can also port it into your favorite fintech app that you use for tracking your money movement on a day-to-day basis. So that was like a quick two line about account aggregators. I know that my friends at Sahamati would probably take umbrage to how short an introduction I gave to account aggregator, but that's simply because we do have a lot more to cover in this report that's there. All right. So the next report that I wanted to talk about was from this very interesting company called F Prime, and they have something called a fintech index that they track. Fintech index is basically a mix of various different parameters. One of it is funding. The other one is about the regulatory environment. The third interesting input that I saw to the fintech index, was on customer trust and indirectly the impact that it had on customer adoption as well. So here also they made some very interesting observations. If I like, again, I'm kind of being biased to the people who will be coming in to watch the replays of this, because on my screen I am actually projecting some of the numbers that they had over here. So according to fintech prime sorry F Prime Fintech Index is the name of the index that they monitored. So the fintech index went up 114% in the last year. However, the peak that they had in 2021, that we've still not managed to reach that. We're still only at 60% of that peak. So while 2022 was a pretty bad year in general for fintechs, we saw a lot of regulatory crackdowns. We saw a lot of funding being cut back. We also, in 2022, we saw a lot of fintech companies go bust simply because they didn't have a very good enough revenue model over there. Still, despite all of that, public fintech companies have found stability, and many sectors have started moving on towards a path of profitability as well. So multiples for public companies. So you have a price to equity multiple that's typically there. They have been going up about 30% according to the fintech index that F Prime tracks over there. And one more thing which is very interesting is that uh, the incumbents have started embracing and in some cases outmaneuvering and outlasting the new technologists, especially in robo advisory. And we'll come to that in just a second. But some of the focus areas where this report kind of focused on was on the regulatory part of it. So if you see in crypto, uh, just India also had its own crypto regulations. Not really regulations, but yes, at least we have some clarity from the government that they're not banning crypto. They're just going to excessively tax crypto transactions, which I think is fair. I mean, at the end of the day, what the government really wants to do is to make sure that customers' money is safeguarded and they're not giving in to blind greed over there. And then another thing which was interesting was that in the European Union, we now actually have a very sturdy regulatory framework. Of course, in the US, we've seen the SEC's regulations and a lot of litigations against a lot of these unregulated exchanges which were there, and that's on the negative side. But on the positive side, the US SEC has also approved a bunch of Bitcoin spot ETFs, and that's led to a huge demand for Bitcoin as an asset class itself. In fact, a lot of large financial institutions, are now starting to see these as a very viable asset class. So that's a very interesting move that's there. On the wealth management and lending side also, like for example in India, RBI has been constantly upgrading the key fact statements just to make sure that there's a lot more transparency in the entire lending process. And of course payments is it's everyone wants to move towards real time payments. And this report also, by the way, covers Pix from Brazil and UPI from India, and how, the entire Fed now model and what's happening in Europe with their central bank digital currencies are all kind of trying to mimic these two big players that are there. So a big kudos to India for having actually rolled out something like UPI back in 2016. All right. Just taking a quick pause here to see if anyone has any observations or any questions out here. If you do, by the way, feel free to use the hand raise option, come up on stage and share your take on this entire very interesting sort of fintech, state of fintech report that's going on over here. Okay, so moving on, we come to what's been happening in the entire funding or the market cap, the entire funding floor that's there. Um, in September 2021, according to F Prime, the fintech index's market cap was about $1.3 trillion dollars. But today, it's become less than half at about $573 billion. Of course, the trough was because of what we saw in 2022, when a lot of funding cut back because of interest rates, which were high for a very long period and stuff like that. But the interesting thing is that we're seeing recovery happen. And the biggest recovery that's been happening happens to be, you will not believe it, in wealth and asset management. I feel so happy about this because I really think a lot of us, while we're very good planners of our money, we don't really focus that much on growing for building and leaving a lasting legacy of sorts. So the fact that that is also happening nowadays, that shift has also started happening. I think I find that very interesting over there. Now, moving on, there is one place where there's a slight and this is a trend that's going to keep continuing, which is consolidations, simply because a lot of fintechs, they're not able to weather this funding winter that's happening, and they're not able to find a proper product market fit for a consumer segment that would be willing to pay for their products. While and this report also kind of highlights a lot of that, which is that while a lot of fintech companies in the initial days, they're able to get customers simply because the venture cap money is kind of cross subsidizing the efforts of the customers having to pay for their services. That is no longer true. A lot of VCs, according to this report, are nowadays asking for a proof of concept that can actually generate revenue. So that shift of conversation is also a pretty interesting insight that this report kind of highlighted. So they're predicting that we will actually see a lot of shutdowns of fintechs also in the coming year, and that's interesting because they feel that there will at least be about 14% companies that will shut down because of this. And this was based on some proprietary model that they run at the background, so I'm probably not going to, I don't have access to that. But yes, I thought that was very interesting that everyone, while they talk about the bright side of fintech, and even today if you see, almost everybody feels that fintech is the hottest sector that's out there, so we should build a fintech company. But the fact that this report highlighted the fact that they do believe 14% of companies as of today are going to go bust in the next 5 years, that should be like a cautionary tale to a lot of people out there. Okay, so next let's go on to another interesting part of this, which is on which was more on, so there have been a lot of headwinds for fintechs, but innovation has become indisputably clear of late nowadays. So for this, the way that they went about doing this is they split it into a 2 by 2 matrix. On one hand, you had the incumbents adoption, and on the other side, you had like the startups disruption over there. And the four metrics that they had, that they'd measured all of these different companies on, was one on, the first one was where there were high fintech innovation, and they have disrupted incumbents and are meaningfully shifting business models away. They have a steady revenue stream and customer expectations, one of which happens to be buy now pay later. And this is very interesting because I remember some time back I was reading this interesting graph where they'd shown that from 2019 on to 2024, the number of new credit cards that were added across the globe had come down. So it used to be somewhere around 33 in 2019. But today, in 2023, when this report was kind of published, it had come down to just about 28, from 33 to 28. Where did all of that 5 go? It went all into buy now, pay later services. So buy now, pay later back in 2019, 2018 was about 5 million customers, new customers being added every year. And in 2023, there were 20 million customers being added every year. So definitely a fourfold increase over there. So most customers are not anymore looking for having a physical card issued by their banks. That's a very interesting disruption that's happening now in India. That has not happened because RBI has made it amply clear that until and unless you are a licensed bank or a lending NBFC, you cannot give loans to your customers. So that's one area where there's a high disruption of incumbents happening. The next area is where innovations have been embraced by both incumbents and disruptors. And this is in the entire mobile transaction space. We've seen a lot of wallets come up. Banks have also started having their own mobile banking apps. And open finance was yet another area of focus for this report. So, yes, kudos to the entire team that's been working day and night behind open finance in India, which is known as Account Aggregator. But yes, next up was some areas where incumbents and financial institutions had kind of outmaneuvered a lot of the fintech companies that were new age fintech companies that were there. And robo advisory, peer to peer lending, surprisingly, and direct to consumer insurance technology were three areas. Now, the reason why direct to consumer insurance was one of the areas where incumbents had outmaneuvered fintech companies, I think this is because it's the entire actuarial science process that's there. It's extremely statistically heavy, and a lot of these companies, these insurance companies, have kind of fine tuned their models to figure out how to underwrite a particular customer, charge them a premium and still not incur a loss. And that's taken them over 100 years to kind of fix and make it a very robust system. So for a lot of these new age companies to replicate that kind of a data set, uh, slightly hard over there. But robo advisory definitely blew my mind because I did assume that companies that were AI first would have probably done a very good job of that. That was not to be the case. All right, taking a quick pause to see if we have anyone else who has a different point of view over here. Okay, then let's move on to how I found this entire piece on robo advisories to be super interesting over here. So, back in 2012, when robo advisories and you know large machine languages which were giving trade uh, queries to be executed, there were only new age fintech companies that were doing it. And two of the biggest fintech companies in that space back in 2012 were Betterment and Wealthfront. Now, between Betterment and Wealthfront in 2012, they had about 99% of the market share over there. Betterment sat at about 52, and Wealthfront sat at 47, 40, roughly about 47. But today, Charles Schwab, Vanguard, and Fidelity, three very old asset management companies, now command over 88% of the market. That is impressive. That is like really impressive. And it kind of, when I started thinking a little more about this, it kind of made a lot more sense because they have a team of analysts that are building models day in and day out. While these models may be on an Excel sheet, yes, very complex and heavy Excel sheets, but they're building a lot of these very complex models that are periodically outperforming the market and benchmark indices. So obviously, if they could automate that entire process and the insight and the intelligence that goes into making these models, they can definitely do a very good job, right? So Vanguard, as of today, in the robo advisory space, thanks to entirely this, does command about 67% of the market, followed by, and they, by the way, are outleading the entire segment by a huge trail, because their next biggest competitor in that space just happens to be Charles Schwab with about 17% of the market share alone. So that's, and when it comes to wealth management, your market share is actually a proxy for your asset under management. So the larger your asset under management is, the larger the commissions that you're going to get and the larger your revenue pie is going to be. Now, I agree that this is a very small segment. Robo advisory, as the entire asset management industry itself, is a very small segment of the pie as of today. But think about it this way: if I had to scale a traditional asset management company today, I would need to continuously keep investing in hiring and training those, teams of analysts over there. Whereas now with robo advisory, it's all about a build once, probably periodically keep tweaking it, but you can serve, you know, 1000x the number of customers that one analyst could have done. So that's very, very powerful for me, at least over there. All right, what do we have next? Meanwhile, any questions? Oh, yes, Manish does. Sorry. Manish, just bringing you up on stage in a minute. Hi, Manish. How are you doing? Hi, Manish. Amazing. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So, two things. So, you basically asked a bunch of questions over there, but I'm going to broadly, classify it into two. One is going to be on the educational aspect of growing your finances, and the next one is going to be how do people, what are the tools that people currently have on managing their wealth? Would that be a fair enough assessment, Manish? Yeah. Yeah. So the way that a lot of these robo advisories work is they do a lot of data abstraction over there. They, of course, they do a lot of data modeling, but for someone who's new to the entire mutual funds or the entire money market space, they don't really need to know a lot of information. They just need to know that what has the benchmark indices being performing, how much has this particular portfolio or this particular mutual fund done over the benchmark indices. Is there a risk, a potential risk? Do they have like a risk exposure to, say, a particular segment of the entire markets, or maybe they're well diversified? And another thing that they'll need to know, which has now become mandatory by the regulators, is the cost that they're going to incur, because this portfolio is going to be managed by someone else, right? You have like a portfolio manager at the back end who's sitting and doing all of this for you. So you also need to know the costs. Whereas when it comes to robo advisories, while you can also ask the robo advisory, you maybe you're not that comfortable with directly trading in the markets and you want someone to do that money management for you, robo advisories can definitely help point you to the right kind of portfolios basis very granular sets of information about you that will help the robo advisory build a better risk model for you. Now, a lot of risk modeling today, if you see, it's a very it's a straight line formula where they assume that the younger a person is, the more risk that they'd be willing to take versus an older person who probably wants a little bit of stability. But what if I am an old person and I've recently come into like a 10 crore inheritance? Then I do have a huge risk appetite, right? So those sort of things, those sort of nuances is something that maybe the robo advisory would be able to help. But if you see in the US, when I was talking about Betterment and Wealthfront, they typically help. So you don't need to, if you want to buy and trade in the stock market, you don't need to know a lot of technical analysis and a lot of fundamental analysis. It will do all of that number crunching, and basis whatever risk profiling that it has assessed of you, it will tell you that, you know what, I know you want to invest in this, but this may be a little too much for your risk appetite. Are you sure you want to continue? And if you do continue, this would be the downside for you, or this would be the upside for you. So that's where kind of wealth advisories have been. In the future, can they also help with the problem that we're facing with respect to literacy? I definitely think so. I mean, that's the easiest thing to solve for, right?
Correct, 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 correct. Understood, understood.
But thank you so much for adding to that, Manish. And I would love to hear about your, because you've been in the entire insurance space. I would love to see how do you see, insurance companies kind of beating fintech players in the insurance game.
So in terms of insurance, I was fascinated about this discussion, slightly diverging from your question. But when I was working with Max Life Pension Fund as a company, when this
Hmm.
PFM setup was done,
Oh yeah.
we were thinking of kind of expanding MLI to new businesses. So one thought that came to our mind was this was pretty early when PFM was set up.
Hmm.
Let's go into wealth management. Now, because let's say MLI agents, when it comes for insurance business, we are meeting around 7 to 8. One agent meets around 7 to 8 consumers, out of
Okay.
which he's able to convert one. Now,
Okay.
whatever the remaining six, if
Hmm.
he's able to, let's say, sell a mutual fund product to them, he's able to sell
Ah, interesting.
some other, and we can
Interesting.
have collaborations. So this was a wide space that we were working upon, and then we also did some research on a similar front of front. And
Very
robo
interesting.
advisory, we followed one of the same research because and this was something that we were trying to figure out. But then later on, as the commission margins for let's say mutual fund or something to invest in equity was not that much, and even from the regulatory point of view, it became a very challenging point
Yeah.
since BFM was started. So we kept this on hold as of now. Let's see how does this go. Very interesting piece. Very interesting.
Definitely. And I think even I will have to go back and do my research on this a little bit more. But thanks for putting that thought into my head.
Definitely, definitely. Even currently, I have this come to this bank insurance as a vertical, but
Huh.
I'll be more than happy to discuss on this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so
Thank
much
you,
for
thank you.
thank
Yeah.
you for that, Manish. Now we will move on to the India side of the entire fintech. The growth of India. And this is Traction's India Rising Fintech Report. By the way, how many fintech companies do you think are there in India today? So I was very, very surprised and pleasantly surprised though when I found out that there are about 12,000 fintech companies in India. The exact number is 11199. So yes, 11,199 fintech companies in India today. Uh, but only about 1,780 of them are funded. So maybe that's why, my entire hypothesis was that there are only about 1,000 fintech companies, because honestly in the news we only hear about funded fintech companies. And the second thing that kind of blew my mind away in this Traction report was that Mumbai is still the financial capital of India. So if you see all the fintech companies that are there in India, about 11 of them, 1,711 companies are based out of Mumbai, followed closely by Bangalore, which is standing at 1651. Now, the reason why we keep thinking of Bangalore being the fintech capital of India is because the number of listed companies in Bangalore, there are about 520 listed companies in Bangalore versus Mumbai, which only has 421 over there. So maybe that's why that entire conception that if you want to be a fintech builder, you have to be in Bangalore. I kind of feel validated now because I'm a fintech builder and I'm in Bombay. And yes, people like us don't get covered simply because we're not yet funded. So that was definitely, a bright spot for me personally over there. Some of the other interesting insights that this report had was on the funding pattern that's been there. So, the total fintech funding ever in India is about $31 billion. And just in the last 2 years, we had raised about 5.7 billion. There were about 44 IPOs of fintech companies. Surprisingly, I can still only remember 14 of them. So I definitely need to go down and hunt down the remaining 30. And there have been about 192 acquisitions in the past few years. Then the next thing that this report kind of highlighted was on the funding that's been going on. Only 9% of funding went into late stage companies, that's Series C and Series D companies. This also, I think, ties back to the entire petering out of the IPO mania for fintech companies that we saw back in 2021. So, a lot of investors too are being cautious that if they do not see a good enough um, ability for the company to generate revenues in the near term, it is probably something that they're using as a proxy to figure out if this company can IPO in the market. And if it does IPO, when they exit, how much of an alpha or how much of a multiple would they get over their investment? So that was a very interesting insight that I found over there. Some of the other the rest of the so honestly, to be very honest, the traction report was very much skewed towards the entire investment side of things, though they did mention that one of the moonshot areas or one of the next new areas that's going to be there in fintech in India is going to be crowdfunding. I found that very interesting, given that there isn't a lot of regulatory clarity around crowdfunding in India, but let's see how that goes. So that was what was there in the India Rising report. It did have a lot of interesting insights on the consumer side of it. So if you are someone who's building a fintech product for India, I would highly suggest going through it. In fact, you know what? If someone would be so kind enough to remind me, I'll probably share this report across tomorrow publicly to everyone to access. It's a very useful report that I think everyone should have their hands on. All right, then let's move on to the final report, which was from Chirate Ventures. And this was very interesting because they did cover a lot about how the landscape in India, in the Indian fintech space, is changing. And one of the things that even I found very interesting, so this is, by the way, just a very personal observation that I've seen. So if you see fintech that was there before, say, 2020, it was all about figuring out what is it that the current financial landscape offers and how can we do it better, without any thoughts to whether this kind of a product service can actually be offered by a non licensed entity or not. So basically, it was just about innovating. So, and if you see at that point in time, it was known as tech first, fin second. That has completely changed now. That's also one of the things that the Chirate Ventures report kind of focuses on, which is on the entire regulatory landscapes and how regulators are also stepping up the game when it comes to fintech in India. And some of the very interesting use cases, again, because it's so close to my heart because I've worked on both these products, was on real time payments in India like UPI and how UPI has been scaling abroad. So one of the things that they had recommended was to make the UPI tech stack a payment or a payment rail as a service stack of sorts. Very interesting concept. Might be challenging to scale, given that you will need to figure out the regulations at each and every country that you're trying to export this tech stack to. But definitely a very big area for companies like PhonePe, which have done fabulously in India, but have simply not been able to monetize that base of users in India. Then another thing that they did focus on was, and this was a segment that I found very interesting. It was not a segment that I had previously thought of, which was wealth management for enterprises. Now, a lot of enterprises, especially large enterprises or even mid-size enterprises, as they start scaling rapidly, have to do a lot of treasury management, and a lot of, if they're dealing with cross border trades and stuff like that, they also have to have a lot of forex swaps and all of that in place, which they may or may not be equipped to deal with. So Tirate Ventures report says that this is a segment that could actually scale and have be like really really profitable in the next 5 years. The timeline that they've given are pretty aggressive, so in 5 years is when they believe it's going to scale that much. So yes, that was also a very interesting aspect that I found in this report. The rest of it was, I kind of found some of their case studies the same old of sorts, where they spoke about the potential for lending to scale in India, how collections is becoming a lot stronger, payments beyond just UPI and RuPay. UPI and credit was one of the things that they spoke about, and how one particular case study that they picked up was that of Peg Local, and how they've actually reached a good product market fit according to this particular study over there. And of course, entire regulatory tech stack that's there, where if you are a fintech builder, you can just focus on building to deliver for your customers need, while the entire regulatory and compliance hurdle is kind of taken over by a reg tech company of sorts. And the example that they gave here was that of Signsy. So these were some of, and another very interesting highlight that I kind of found was that while from the peak of 2021, investors did kind of stop invested, but they do believe that a lot of investor confidence is coming back into the ecosystem. And some of the places where investors are showing a lot of interest in is on companies that are building on top of the digital public infrastructure that's there. So whether it's ONDC financials or account aggregator, and all of those, that's a very interesting area that in the next 5 years, according to them, it's going to solve a very pertinent demand for expanding financial services to the underserved, as well as also see good revenue streams coming in, making increasing investors' confidence in these segments. So that was again another very interesting sort of a piece from this report that was there. That's it from my end. So if anyone has any more questions or any other points that they would love to add, please do hit the hand raise button at the bottom, and I will promptly bring you up on stage. Yes, we do have Kongalu up on stage with us. Hello, Kongalu Sukumar. How are you doing?
Yeah, that's a very spellbound analysis you have done.
Actually, this was not my analysis. I just made sure I read 5 reports, so thank you so much.
Really, just now I have given some sign, sort of appreciation stating that outstanding and scintillating. But see, my point here is that if the wealth and investment is concentrated in one point, we would not achieve decentralization of both wealth and development also. In this regard, would you like to focus on it?
Oh, very, very interesting that you bring this up, sir. Why? Because just recently, BIS, which is
Yes.
the central bank for central bankers, and Nandan Nilekani kind of came up with a paper which is known as Finternet. And they call this the financial system for the future, where they're talking about tokenizing all the assets and liabilities that are there on a central bank's books. The reason why, because they feel this tokenization is something that will lead to enhanced financial inclusion world over, and will stop from having the concentration of power in the hands of few. Because the minute you start tokenizing assets, be it bank deposits or even liabilities that are there, it just makes it a lot more accessible. Now, for example, I may let's assume that I'm someone who's from the lower tier rung of the economy. Now, if I want to open a bank account and I walk into, say, a Kotak branch, and they say that, madam, the minimum balance that you need to keep with us is 25,000, that is a large amount for someone at the bottom of the pyramid. So they're not going to be able to get access to that banking service. Versus, let's say that we open a Kotak minimum, whatever the base account is there, but we tokenize that, so that that deposit is split into, say, 25 parts, 25 tokens. And if I want access to banking system, I just have to pay that 1,000 deposit, and I have access to that. It's a pool bank that I have access to. I think this is a very interesting sort of an area that's there, Sukumar sir, which is a concept paper at the moment. But yes, I definitely do see a lot of possibilities for this leading to better financial inclusion.
Yeah, I would like to pose one more thing also. See, can I, may I?
Yes, sir, of course. Please.
Yeah, see, the post-COVID has given two challenges. One is the self-sufficiency at national level. The,
Hmm.
the other thing is that it has posed so many things as far as the employment in finance is concerned.
Yeah.
Keeping in view of the present global scenario in terms of economy and security, I would like to emphasize that why can't there be a encouragement of small scale sector and small scale sector investment so that because the global scenario is that such that due to various reasons
Hmm.
the multinational companies are really facing a lot of challenges.
Hmm.
At one point of time, we don't know what is happening. But
True.
if at all the small scale sector is being encouraged, in two ways it would give security. One way of redistribution of economy,
Hmm.
the other way it will create a lot of employment also. There
Hmm.
would be chances of rising entrepreneurship, and so that it would lead to lesser dependency on neighboring or etc. as far as the imports are concerned. So this is my little observation as far as the things are concerned.
Very interesting thought over there, Sukumarji, because here we're saying that we don't want to increase employment, we want to increase the people who provide employment. Very interesting.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for that thought. And with that, it has been a great 45 minutes with all of you here today. I am calling it a wrap on today's session. But we will be back again next week with something that Sukumarji already teased for us, by the way, which is on the entire tokenization of assets and liabilities of central banks. I think it's a very interesting project, and Finternet is what we will be discussing next week.